The FIFA World Cup is the world's biggest sporting event. It started way back in 1930 and has been held in every continent, other than Antarctica and Oceania, the freak continents. So we're going to take a look back at the venues that have hosted the final of each tournament, and see what they look like then as well as what they're looking like today. Here is every World Cup final stadium. We start in Uruguay, oddly enough. Estadio Centenario gets its name due to it being built to commemorate the 100-year anniversary of the country's constitution. In fact, the 100-year anniversary is a big part of why they hosted the World Cup in the first place. The host beat Argentina 4-2 in the final. The most remarkable thing about the stadium is that, although the capacity has been reduced since it first opened, for safety reasons, and the stadium is now in colour instead of black and white, it's still more or less the same design as it was back then. A big, open, split-level, segmented bowl. Now to Italy and a stadium that no longer exists. Stadio Nazionale PNF. You can tell it no longer exists because it's named after the country's fascist party, which went the way of Mussolini, and rightfully so. It was a big step down in terms of capacity, but more than big enough to meet the demand for most matches. The stadium did feature some intricate details in true Italian fashion. Once again, it was the hosts who won. They beat Czechoslovakia 2-1. Nowadays, it's a completely separate stadium, Stadio Flaminio, and it looks like its heyday has already come and gone. Just shows you how long ago 1934 was. Stade Olympique de Colombe. As the name might suggest, it hosted the Olympics. That was 14 years prior to this World Cup. Italy won once more, beating Hungary 4-2, which proves the old saying right, you can't win a World Cup on an empty stomach. It remained the country's biggest venue for decades to come, and although it has switched to being a rugby venue, the stadium is still up and running today. It'll be hosting some field hockey at the 2024 Olympics, exactly 100 years after it hosted the Olympics. The next World Cup wasn't until 12 years later. You can probably have a guess why. This technically wasn't an actual final. They had a final group stage, but the game between Uruguay and Brazil decided it all, which is what finals do. So it was a final. Maracanã had just been built prior to the tournament, and at the time it had a ridiculous capacity. Uruguay won their second World Cup, beating Brazil 2-1, in front of 200,000 or so spectators. Unsurprisingly, that's the biggest crowd to witness a World Cup final, if you want to call it that. It makes another appearance, so I'll show you what it looks like now, later. Wankdorfstadion. Depending on where you are from, you either just chuckled upon hearing that name or you didn't blink an eyelid. It's simply named after the area of Bern in which it's located. Wankdorf. I assume that's the red light district. Anyway, it had been around for quite a while before this World Cup, but it was given a major capacity boost for the event. Still small by Brazil standards, but big by Swiss standards. Hungary was once more on the losing end against all odds. West Germany won it 3-2. By the early 2000s, the stadium was way outdated and it was demolished, with Stade de Suisse built in its place. Råsunda Stadium. Scandinavia's only World Cup to date was held in Sweden, the capital of Scandinavia, or something. The design of the stadium was fairly standard at the time of hosting, but it remained as Sweden's national stadium for quite some time, and gradually increased in capacity. But due to room constraints, it ended up with a bit of a unique seating layout. It went on to host the Women's World Cup final in the 90s, making it the first stadium to host both. As for the result of the 1958 final, Brazil finally won their first of 5 World Cups, beating the hosts 5-2. It was demolished about a decade ago, and well, there are just some shops and apartments there now. Estadio Nacional. This stadium has a bit of a dark history, being used as a detention center during the years of military rule in the country. That came about a decade after it hosted the final. The design was actually partially inspired by a stadium in Berlin that's coming up later on. although there are only a few similarities. It didn't take long for Brazil to win their second. They beat Czechoslovakia 3-1. It's still the home of Chile's national team, and although it's been renovated since the tournament, it remains a simple single-tiered bowl. You wouldn't say it was world class, but it's a decent venue. Wembley Stadium. It was known as the home of football, and I say was because it exists nowadays in name only. It was completely flattened, including those iconic towers, which is a bit of a shame. I love that unique bolt-on upper deck that surrounded the entirety of the lower seating bowl, but that didn't come until after the World Cup, as you can see by its absence in these shots. This is still the one and only World Cup England has hosted, and it's their one and only win. They beat West Germany 4-2. Nowadays its shiny successor occupies the site. I wonder if it will ever host a World Cup final. Estadio Azteca was the host of North America's first World Cup final. It was actually built just prior to the '68 Olympics, where it hosted some football. And that was the perfect warm-up for football's biggest event, where Brazil beat Italy 4-1. Back when it hosted, it could hold over 100,000 people. Once more, it makes another appearance, so you'll see the current stadium later on. Just like Estadio Azteca, the Olympiastadion in Munich had just hosted the Olympics 2 years prior to the tournament. And not just some football, it was the actual Olympic Stadium, as the name might suggest. It was a design well ahead of its time, with its revolutionary lightweight roof that was meant to mimic the peaks of the nearby Alps, and its distinctive asymmetrical sunken layout. Despite the track, it's still one of my favourite stadiums to host a final. The hosts, West Germany, beat the Dutch 2-1. Nowadays it's almost the same as it was back then, but it still looks somewhat modern after 50 years. El Monumental. Just like Estadio Azteca, again, it had in the past hosted crowds of 100,000. Perhaps when security measures were a little lackluster, because it was only slightly more than 70,000 that witnessed the Dutch lose yet another final. This time 3-1 Argentina's way. Damn, home field advantage is no joke. That's like a 40% strike rate for the home team so far. This stadium was world class when it was built, but it was built in the 30s. And the double-tiered bowl has remained very similar to how it was when it hosted the final, as you can see. Estadio Santiago Bernabeu. Interestingly, Camp Nou had a very similar capacity at the time, yet Madrid was chosen as the host of the final without hesitation. I can only assume that's the main factor behind Catalonia's independence movement. Ever since it opened in the 40s, the stadium has been fairly consistently renovated and expanded over the decades, including right before the World Cup, where the capacity was actually reduced, but it finally gained a bit of a roof. Italy 3, West Germany 1. It's currently undergoing a renovation that will give it a sleek metallic exterior with a retractable roof, as well as upgrading the interior. Estadio Azteca again. It hadn't really changed much in the 16 years. This time around, Argentina beat West Germany 3-2. The current stadium has a decreased capacity, but increased advertising revenue, as you can see. Wonder if Coca-Cola and Corona just said, "Look, we'll pay for the seats as long as we get to choose the colors. Are you sure? You're not gonna plaster your logo everywhere? Because that will cheapen it." Nah, just some artwork. Okay, now we've got to the point where all the stadiums are basically identical to how they were when they hosted, so I'll mostly use current images. Stadio Olimpico. The Olimpico in the name refers to the 1960 Olympics that it hosted, but it was the major renovation prior to the 1990 World Cup, where most of the original stadium was demolished, that made it the stadium it is today. This section here is all that remains of the original stadium, with the other three sides being surrounded by a big curving single tier of seats. It was a replay of the last final with West Germany getting revenge on Argentina, winning 1-0. Rose Bowl. In '94, for the first time, the World Cup final made its way to a country that prefers its own version of football. I feel like this stadium gets mentioned more than any other on this channel, and it's probably because it has its hand in so many of the world's biggest events. It's one of America's most iconic stadiums for both American football and football. This final was the first to go to penalties, Brazil beating Italy 3-2 in the shootout. The design has remained pretty much the same since it opened way back in the day. A true bowl in both name and nature. I'd imagine it will stay that way until, well, it will probably outlast civilization, to be honest. Stade de France, the French football team's home, was opened in the same year as the World Cup that it hosted. Surprisingly, it was the first final host venue since the Maracanã to do so. Like some of the other stadiums we've seen so far, it does have a track around the field, but this is the first to include movable seats that roll over the track, to make it a true multi-purpose stadium. Overall, I think it's a fantastic venue, but I doubt most Liverpool fans have the same positive feelings towards the stadium. It was a comprehensive win for the home side, beating Brazil 3-0. 2002 was the first time the World Cup came to Asia, as Japan and South Korea shared hosting duties. It was International Stadium Yokohama in Japan that got to host the final. This stadium was opened in the same year as Stade de France, and it's one of the few cases of the French out-engineering the Japanese, because not only do they have a running track without movable seating to compensate, but the seats here are miles away from the field, particularly in the corners. Other than that, it's alright, I guess. It was Brazil 2, West Germany plus the power of East Germany, 0. But at least they're friends again. Dankeschön, Mr. Heiselhoff. Speaking of Deutschland, Olympiastadion. But this time it's the one in Berlin. The historic venue that hosted the infamous 36 Olympics had just been transformed from its derelict state prior to the tournament into a marvelous modern-ish venue, whilst preserving some of its historic features, most notably the stone facade and the Marathon Gate. Oh yes, I remember the 2006 World Cup. Italy put their practice with the nation's Olympic diving team prior to the tournament to good use, and went on to beat France on penalties in the final. We're really ticking off the continents as the World Cup made its way to Africa for the first time. It was also the first time the games sounded like they were being held in the middle of a beehive. FNB Stadium, or Soccer City as it was known during the World Cup, is a spectacular venue. The exterior was designed to resemble some African pot, which in itself was meant to look like this African plant. The calabash. That's another name for the stadium. Whatever, it looks great, as does that all-orange interior. The result, the Netherlands 0, Spain 1. I suppose that's why Heineken is so widespread. The Dutch are really good at bottling it. 3 finals without a win. Back to Brazil at the new Maracanã. It's very much a Wembley Stadium of the South in the way it's revered by the locals. But unlike Wembley, it was renovated and restructured to get to its current state, rather than being completely demolished. It went from a genuine double-decker to more of a split single-tiered bowl. They accomplished this by demolishing the first tier and building new steeper seating in its place. After humiliating the home side in the semis, the Germans went on to beat Argentina 1-0 in the final, offering some solace to Brazil, I guess. 4 years after invading their neighbour, the world was cool with Russia hosting the World Cup. Luzhniki Stadium, Putin's favourite, hosted the final. The historic venue was given a major overhaul prior to the tournament, with the old facade being basically all that remained from the original stadium. And credit where credit's due, I do like to see that preservation of history. Of course, it looks pretty much the same today as it did when it hosted, just with the letter Z plastered all over it. Oh yeah, and France beat Croatia 4-2. Croatia must be the smallest country since Uruguay back in the day to have made the final. Props to them. In 2022, the World Cup will make its way to the Middle East for the first time. The final will be held at Lusail Iconic Stadium. The shimmering showpiece venue of the tournament was inspired by a traditional lantern. Yeah, you know what? I think I recall when Harry Potter was walking through the woods with Hagrid. Yeah, he was holding something resembling this in his hand. Fair enough. Obviously I can't tell you the result, but I'll make a prediction. Just because I feel like it's long overdue, I'm gonna say Czechoslovakia versus the Ottoman Empire, with the latter winning 3-1. And that was every World Cup final venue. If you enjoyed the video, then why not consider subscribing? Thanks for watching, have a good one.